Word spread through the human colonies like wildfire, jumping from system to system. Through the communication networks, and the stand at New Haven became instant legend as songs were written and memorials were erected and children were named after. The crew members who had given everything in the Defiant's last stand became a rallying cry for human resistance against the Corvan Empire. In the Corvan Empire itself, the defeat sparked fierce debate among the leadership, because some called for overwhelming retaliation to show humanity the price of defiance, while others argued for caution, saying that if one human ship could do this much damage, then what could a prepared human fleet accomplish? The Empire had always conquered other species, through intimidation and overwhelming force, because they picked fights they knew they could win, and they crushed resistance before it could organize properly. But humanity was not responding according to the plan at all, and they were not breaking under pressure, and instead they were fighting back with a ferocity that the Corvans had not anticipated or prepared for. In a chamber deep within the Imperial Palace, on the Corvan homeworld, the High Council convened, and the 5 most powerful beings in the entire Empire debated the future of their war with humanity. Council member Draxon argued forcefully, saying, "The humans are technologically inferior to us, and we should overwhelm them with our superior numbers before they can organize their defenses properly." Council member Jevrin countered by saying, "Numbers that we no longer have in abundance because the Defiant destroyed nearly 40 of our ships, and that represents an entire battle group, and how many more losses can we sustain? If every human ship fights the way that one did," Draxon demanded, "then what do you propose that we surrender to these upstart humans just because one ship got lucky?" The council matriarch, who was the eldest and wisest of the 5, spoke for the first time, and her voice carried the weight of centuries as she said, "Not surrender but reassessment, because we assumed humanity would be an easy conquest, but we were clearly wrong, and this war will cost us far more than we originally anticipated, and we must decide if the prize is worth the price we will have to pay." The council fell into uncomfortable silence as each member contemplated the same troubling truth, that the war with humanity had fundamentally changed, and the humans had drawn a line in space, and at New Haven Station, they had proven they would pay any price to hold that line. Meanwhile, at the New Haven debris field, a single human salvage ship called the Remembrance hung motionless in space, and Captain Nicole Turner had been given a solemn mission to recover what remained of the Defiant and her crew, so they could be brought home. She asked her scanning officer, "Anything yet?" The officer replied, "Fragments, Captain, because most of the ship was vaporized in the collision with the flagship, but we are finding personal effects and pieces of hull plating with the ship's name still visible, and it should be enough to bring home." Nicole nodded and said, "Collect everything you can find, because every piece and every fragment that we can identify matters, because they died as heroes and they deserve to come home to their families." As her crew worked carefully through the debris field, Nicole stared out at the scattered remains and wondered what kind of people could make such a choice, and to know that death was absolutely certain and that there would be no rescue and no survival, and to fly into it anyway because other people needed time to escape. She found part of her answer when they recovered a data recorder from a piece of the bridge section that had somehow survived the explosion, and the last words of Captain Jake Morrison had been preserved and recorded just moments before the impact. The recording said, "To whoever finds this message, we did not die in despair or in fear, but we died doing what humanity does best, and we held the line when no one else could, and we protected innocent people, and we faced impossible odds, and we made the enemy pay for every single inch they took, and tell our families that we loved them, and tell our people that we believed in them, and tell the Corvans that if they want Earth, they will have to go through 10,000 more ships just like us, because the Defiant stands eternal." Nicole felt tears running down her face as she listened, and she carefully secured the data recorder, because this message would be heard across all of human space, and it would become both a promise and a warning to anyone who threatened humanity. The Corvans had started this war, thinking humanity was weak and easy to conquer, but the Defiant had taught them a very different lesson, and now the real war would begin, and humanity would be ready for whatever came next. 6 months after the stand at New Haven, the war between Humanity and the Corvan Empire had transformed into a brutal stalemate, where neither side could gain decisive advantage, and every battle proved extremely costly for both civilizations. But something fundamental had shifted in the calculations that both sides were making. At the Terran Naval Academy on Earth, a new class of cadets stood at rigid attention in Memorial Hall, and the walls were lined with displays showing humanity's naval heroes throughout history. But one display dominated the center of the entire room, and it showed the crew of the USS Defiant Commandant Victoria Hayes stood before the cadets in her crisp uniform, and she had served with Jake Morrison years ago before he took command of the Defiant, and she still remembered the determined young officer who always volunteered for the most difficult assignments. She told the cadets, "You stand here today because 200 people chose duty over survival, and Captain Morrison could have retreated and his crew could have abandoned ship, and every tactical manual ever written would have justified those choices. But they did not think about justifications or excuses, and instead they thought about 3 million people who desperately needed time to escape." She gestured to the display showing the Defiant's last stand and the tactical overlay that showed the impossible odds they had faced, and she said, "Study this battle carefully and learn from it, but not because we want you to die gloriously, but because we need you to understand what it truly means to be human. And we hold the line, and when other people need us, and when the odds are impossible, and when retreat is the logical choice, we find a way to hold the line anyway." Among the cadets stood young Alex Morrison, who was Jake's nephew, and he had enrolled in the academy the week after learning of his uncle's death. And next to him stood Laura Monroe, who was Kate's daughter, and she was determined to become an engineer just like her mother had been. And throughout the academy, children and siblings of the Defiant's crew had joined up because they were carrying on the legacy in the Corvan Empire. The legacy was very different, but equally profound, because Fleet Commander Velkas had become Grand Admiral after his controversial decision to let the evacuation fleet escape, and he had become an unlikely voice for peace within the military leadership. He stood before the Corvan Strategic Command presenting his careful analysis, and he said, "We have fought humanity for 6 months since New Haven, and every single battle has been costly, and every human ship fights with the same determination that the Defiant showed, and they do not surrender easily, and they do not break under pressure, and they learn from every engagement we have with them." He displayed casualty figures on the main screen and continued, "We have lost 214 ships since this war began, and we have destroyed perhaps 500 human vessels, and the mathematics seem favorable until you understand the strategic picture, because humanity is building ships faster than we can destroy them, and they have turned their entire civilization into a war machine, and meanwhile, our resources are stretched thin across a dozen different fronts." One of the council members asked incredulously, "You suggest we seek peace with these humans after they have killed so many of our warriors?" Velkas replied carefully, "I suggest we negotiate from a position of strength, while we still can, because the humans proved at New Haven that they will pay any price to defend their people and their territory. So we either commit fully to their complete extermination, which will cost us thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of warriors, or we find terms that both sides can accept." The debate raged through the Corvan leadership for weeks, and some called Velkas a coward and a traitor, while others recognized the uncomfortable truth in his assessment that the war was becoming completely unsustainable for the Empire. Amy said quietly, "We did not come here to survive because we came here to hold the line, and that is what we are going to do." Around the bridge, the other crew members nodded in agreement, and these 200 souls had already accepted their fate hours ago when they first saw the size of the Corvan fleet, and now they would choose how to meet death with dignity and purpose. Jake opened a shipwide channel one final time and said, "All hands, this is the captain, and you have all performed beyond any measure of courage or skill, and you have made humanity proud, but our fight is not over yet because the Corvan flagship is moving to destroy us, and we cannot survive its main weapon. So Chief Monroe has proposed a final option, and we ram the flagship and take it down with us, and this means no survivors and no rescue, but it means the evacuation fleet gets away safely, and I am ordering all non-essential personnel to the escape pods immediately, and that is a direct order." He paused for a moment and then continued, "For those who choose to stay, I can only say thank you, and it has been my greatest honor to serve with you, and now bridge out." Jake waited expecting a flood of crew members to head for the escape pods, but instead, not. A single person on the ship moved from their station, and Dan Foster shook his head, saying, "Captain, the escape pods will not get far enough away before the Corvin fleet picks them off, and we all know that. So we stay together, until the end, throughout." The Defiant. The same response echoed on every deck, and in engineering, Kate and her team remained at their posts, keeping the dying ship alive and in sickbay. Dr. Rodriguez continued treating the wounded, even though he knew they only had minutes left, and at weapon stations and tactical positions and damage control teams every single crew member chose to stay. Paul smiled sadly and said, "Looks like you are stuck with us." Sir Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he kept his voice steady and said, "Then let us make this count, and Lisa plot a ramming course for the Eternal Dominion, and Kate give me everything left in the tanks, and when they drop their shields to fire that cannon, we accelerate to maximum speed, and we do not stop for anything." The chorus of responses came back saying, "Aye, Captain." The Defiant turned toward the massive Corvin flagship with her hull scarred and burning and her systems failing, but her crew remained unbowed and determined, and the distance closed steadily as 10,000 kilometers became 5,000 and then 2,000. The Eternal Dominion's main cannon glowed bright with gathered energy that could destroy a planet, and Zektar watched the human ship approach with grim satisfaction, and he said to his weapons officer, "Fire when ready and end." This Amy called out, "Energy spike detected," and they are about to fire, and their shields are dropping across their entire ship just like Kate predicted. Jake gave the order saying, "Now Lisa, and full acceleration right now." The Defiant's engines roared one last time as they pushed the ship toward the enemy flagship at impossible speed, and every remaining reactor poured all its energy into the drive, and the ship vibrated with the strain of forces it was never designed to handle. Zektar's eyes widened suddenly as he realized what the humans intended to do, and he shouted evasive maneuvers and all power to shields immediately, but his order came too late. The Defiant struck the Eternal Dominion amidships at point 6. The speed of light and the impact was absolutely cataclysmic as both ships vanished in an expanding sphere of nuclear fire when their reactors breached and antimatter containment failed, and the shockwave ripped through the Corvin fleet, damaging dozens of ships and completely destroying 5 that were positioned too close to the impact point. In that single moment, 200 human souls and 5,000 Corvin warriors became nothing but fire and light and legend. The evacuation transports continued loading civilians who watched in horror and awe as the Defiant made her final sacrifice, and behind them, the path to safety was now clear because the Corvin fleet was in chaos. The debris field that had once been the Defiant and the Eternal Dominion drifted through space as cooling metal and frozen air marked the grave of warriors from 2 civilizations, and the remaining Corvin fleet hung motionless as they tried to comprehend what they had just witnessed on the bridge of the Corvin battlecruiser Retribution. The newly promoted fleet commander Velkus stared at the tactical display in complete silence, and the human ship was gone along with the mighty Eternal Dominion and commander, Zektar, and the cost of this battle was 34 Corvin vessels destroyed, and 23 more too damaged to continue fighting, and over 40,000 warriors were dead. All of this devastation had been caused by a single human cruiser, the Avrubi. Tactical officer said, "Commander, the human evacuation fleet is preparing to jump to faster than light speed, and they are within our firing range. So do we pursue and destroy them?" Velkas watched the transports on his screen, and they were packed with civilians who owed their lives to the sacrifice he had just witnessed, and his warrior's heart burned for vengeance. But something else stirred within him that he had never felt toward an enemy before, and that feeling was respect. He said slowly, "No, we will not pursue them because they earned their escape today, so let them go," his tactical officer said with shock. "But Commander, our orders were to eliminate all human presence in this system." Velkus turned to face his subordinate and said, "Our orders came from Zektar, and he is dead now, and I will not spend more Corvin lives today trying to kill refugees, because the humans made their point very clear, and this system belongs to them, and we are withdrawing immediately." The Corvin fleet turned as one and jumped away into faster-than-light travel, leaving the system to humanity and to the ghosts of the fallen. On the lead evacuation transport, Admiral Gregory Harris watched the enemy fleet disappear from his sensors, and beside him, his aide, waited for orders while trying to process what had just happened. The aide said in disbelief, "Sir, they are really leaving and we are actually clear." Harris nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the debris field where the Defiant had made her last stand, and he asked, "How many did we save?" The aide checked his console and replied, "Final count is 3,142,000 civilians." "Sir, and that means every single person on New Haven Station got out safely." The Admiral's hand tightened on the railing until his knuckles turned white, and he asked, "And what about the Defiant?" The aide's voice was quiet as he said, "No survivors, sir, and no escape pods were launched, and they stayed with the ship until the very end." Harris had been in the military for 40 years, and he had seen countless battles and lost too many good friends. But this was something different, and this was something that would echo through history for generations to come. He said, "Get me a secure communication line to Earth Command immediately, because they need to know what happened here today, and they need to know what Captain Morrison and his crew sacrificed for us." The news reached Earth 3 days later, traveling through the communication relays, and in the halls of the Terran Defense Headquarters, Fleet Admiral Christine Bradley read the battle report for the 3rd time, because she still could not quite believe what she was reading. A single heavy cruiser had held off an entire Corvan battle fleet for 6 full hours, and it had destroyed or disabled dozens of enemy ships and eliminated their flagship, and bought time for the largest civilian evacuation in human history, and the crew had chosen certain death over retreat, and had turned their ship into a weapon when all else failed. Commander Henry Walsh, who was her chief of staff, said quietly, "This will change everything, because when the Corvans learn that one human ship and 200 people inflicted this kind of damage, and that they willingly sacrificed themselves for civilians, it changes the entire calculation of what a war with humanity will cost." Then Bradley nodded in agreement and said, "More importantly, it shows our own people what we are truly capable of when we are pushed to the wall, and the Corvans thought we were weak and that we would scatter when they pushed. But Captain Morrison proved them completely wrong." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the rebuilt defense installations that surrounded Earth like a protective shell, and she said, "Morrison and Sullivan and Hendricks and Monroe and Palmer and Chen and Rodriguez and Foster and Lopez and all the others held the line when no one else could. And now we build on what they bought us with their lives, and we make sure their sacrifice meant something real." The Corvan fleet changed their tactics because they were frustrated that a single human ship had held them off for so long, and Fleet Commander Zektar was furious as he watched his forces take losses from what should have been an easy target, and he ordered all his vessels to concentrate their fire on a single point of the Defiant's defenses until they broke through. The starboard shields of the Defiant collapsed completely under the focused assault from dozens of enemy ships all firing at once, and Amy shouted over the sound of explosions that were now shaking the bridge, saying, "Shields are gone on the starboard side, and we are taking direct hits to the hull now." The ship lurched violently to one side, and sparks showered down from overhead panels, and 3 bridge stations went completely dark as power conduits overloaded, and the smell of burning electronics filled the air. Kate's voice came through from engineering, and she sounded strained as she said, "Captain, I have lost. Reactor number 3 and reactor number 2 is running at 130% capacity, and she will not hold much longer at this rate." Jake gave the order, saying, "Make her hold, Chief," and then he told Lisa to roll the ship and present the port side to the enemy, and he told Amy to give them everything they had left. The Defiant spun on her axis like a dancer and brought her remaining shields to bear on the enemy, while her weapons fired in a continuous barrage that lit up the darkness of space, and 2 more Corvan ships died in the fury, but it was not nearly enough to stop what was coming. Commander Zektar watched from his flagship bridge as his tactical officer reported the losses with increasing concern, and the officer said, "Commander, we have now lost 9 ships with 17 more damaged, and this single human vessel is costing us more than entire battle groups." "Usually do," Zektar snarled in anger and said, "Then send more ships, and I want that human vessel destroyed right now, and I do not care what it costs." 20 additional Corvan vessels broke from the main formation and charged directly at the Defiant in what looked like a suicide run, because they would absorb her fire, and close to point-blank range where Even a dying ship could inflict fatal damage on the enemy. Paul saw the tactical display and understood what was happening, and he said urgently, "They are going kamikaze, sir, and we need to retreat right now, or we will be overwhelmed and destroyed." Jake looked at the countdown timer that showed 4 hours down and 2 more to go, and he opened a channel to the evacuation fleet and said, "Admiral Harris, what is your status right now?" The response came quickly from Admiral Gregory Harris, and his weathered face filled the screen as he said, "Morrison, we are at 65% complete and we need 90 more minutes, and can you give us that much time?" Jake looked around at his crew and saw Amy at her station, which was sparking, but she was still firing the weapons, and he saw Chris bleeding from a head wound but still maintaining weapons control, and Lisa was calculating impossible escape routes, and Paul stood loyal beside him, ready to follow any order. And throughout the ship, 200 brave people had not flinched once. Jake made his decision and said, "We will give you your 90 minutes, Admiral." And then he closed the channel and turned to his crew, saying, "All hands brace for impact because we are not running from this fight." 20 Corvin ships accelerated to attack speed, with their weapons blazing like 20 small suns. And they were coming in so fast that there was no time to think, only time to react. And the Defiant stood completely alone in their path. The enemy wave hit them like a tidal wave of fire, and the bridge shook so violently that Jake thought this was finally the end. But somehow, impossibly, Kate kept the ship together, and power kept flowing to the weapons, and to the engines, and to life support. And the Defiant kept fighting, Amy announced in a hoarse voice. "Shields are completely down now, and we are fighting on armor and hope alone," Jake replied. "Then make our armor count, and Lisa keep us moving, and do not let them get a steady weapons lock on us." The navigator's fingers flew across her console as she threaded the Defiant through the enemy formation like a needle through cloth, and the old cruiser twisted and turned, presenting her heaviest armor to incoming fire while her weapons carved through the Corvin assault wave. 3 enemy ships died in the first minute of close combat, and 4 more fell in the second minute. But the Defiant was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and hull breaches dotted her structure, and fires raged on multiple decks, and casualties were mounting by the minute. Dr. Rodriguez worked frantically in sickbay, and his medical team was overwhelmed by the wounded pouring in, and he called to the bridge saying, "I need more hands down here, and anyone who can hold a plasma torch or carry a stretcher." Jake ordered, "Send anyone who can be spared from damage control." And Paul was already moving to coordinate everything, and despite the desperate situation, the crew functioned like a well-oiled machine, because years of training and months of combat had forged them into something exceptional. Lieutenant Chris Palmer's weapon station exploded in a shower of sparks and metal, and he was thrown backward with his arm clearly broken and hanging at a wrong angle. But, without any hesitation, Ensign Maria Lopez jumped from the science station into the weapon seat. Maria called out with her hands shaking, but steady enough, saying, "I have got weapons control now, and targeting solutions are locked." The Defiance rail. Guns fired again, and another Corvin ship paid the ultimate price for underestimating the human vessel commander. Zektar watched from the Eternal Dominion in growing disbelief as his tactical display showed 15 more ships destroyed or disabled by the single human vessel. And it was impossible. And it defied every tactical doctrine and every probability calculation his computers could make. He demanded of his tactical officer, "How are they still fighting, and why have we not destroyed them yet?" The officer studied his readouts carefully and said, "Commander, their ship is nearly dead with multiple hull breaches, and weapon systems failing, and shields are non-existent, but they refuse to stop fighting, and every system they have left is dedicated to weapons and engines." Zektar made his decision, saying, "Then we will break them utterly," and he ordered the Eternal Dominion forward with all power to main guns and said, "We will personally destroy this human ship and end this humiliation." Once and for all, the massive flagship began moving forward, and its weapons array started lighting up with gathering energy, and the Eternal Dominion's main cannon was powerful enough to punch through a planet's crust, and against a damaged cruiser, it would mean complete annihilation. Paul saw the sensor readings, and his face went pale as he said, "Captain, the flagship is charging its main weapon, and that is a planet killer, and we cannot possibly survive that shot." Jake studied the tactical display and saw that the Eternal Dominion would be in firing range in 3 minutes, and the evacuation status showed 85% complete, and they were so very close to success. He asked, "How long until the transports can jump to faster than light?" Speed Dan Foster checked his console and replied, 65 minutes minimum because they need to clear the station's mass shadow before they can safely jump. It was not enough time. And even if the Defiant somehow survived the Eternal Dominion's attack, she could not last another hour against the full Corvin fleet that was still mostly intact. Kate's voice came through the intercom, sounding exhausted but still determined as she said, "Captain, I have an idea, and it is completely crazy, and it will probably kill us all, but it might just work if we are lucky." Jake said, "I am listening, Chief, so tell me what you are thinking." Kate explained. "That planet killer weapon they are charging draws massive power from their main reactors, and for about 10 seconds before they fire, their shields will be weakened to compensate for the energy drain, and if we can time it exactly right, and if we can get close enough, we could ram them amidships, and our reactor breach would gut their ship from the inside." The bridge fell completely silent as everyone processed what Kate was suggesting, and it was a suicide plan with no possibility of survival. But it would take the Corvin flagship out of the fight and give the evacuation fleet the time they desperately needed. Paul spoke very softly, saying, "Captain, if we do this, there will be no escape pods and no survivors, and everyone aboard the ship dies today." Jake looked at each member of his crew and saw young faces and old faces, and he saw human determination in every single expression. And they knew what he was considering, and he saw no fear in their eyes but only resolve and acceptance. The war had been coming for a long time, but nobody thought it would happen so fast. And when the Corvin Empire finally attacked the human colonies, they were caught completely unprepared, and within just a few weeks the outer settlements went dark, one by one until there was nothing left but silence in the empty void of space. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, the USS Defiant, and looked at the tactical screen with growing concern, because what he saw there was not good at all, and his ship was old and worn from too many battles, and his crew of 200 people was all that stood between the advancing Corvin fleet and the 3 million civilians trying to escape from New Haven Station. And behind them, those 3 million souls were desperately loading onto transport ships, hoping to get away before the enemy arrived. The orders from the Admiral were clear and simple enough to understand, but impossible to follow, because they said, "Hold your position for 6 hours while the evacuation completes," but the sensor readings told a very different story than what the Admiral hoped for. And the Corvin fleet was not just big, but absolutely massive, with 73 warships bearing down on their location, and leading them all was the flagship called Eternal Dominion, which was 3 times larger than the Defiant. Lieutenant Commander Amy Sullivan sat at her tactical station, and her face showed the fear she was trying to hide as she looked up at Jake and said, "Captain, the updated scans now show 82 hostile vessels coming our way, because they brought even more reinforcements than we thought." Commander Paul Hendricks was the executive officer, and he stepped closer to Jake and spoke quietly, so the rest of the bridge crew would not hear everything he said. And he told Jake that, "Sir, we cannot possibly hold against those numbers, and we should recommend an immediate evacuation abort and full retreat right now before it is too late." Jake knew the math of desperate situations better than most officers because he had been in tight spots before, and he understood that the transport ships were slow and had no weapons, and they were packed way beyond their safe capacity with frightened people, and if the Defiant ran away, now the Corvins would catch the refugee fleet within an hour, and 3 million lives would be lost forever. Jake made his decision and said in a voice that was quiet but firm, "We hold the line." And then he told the communications officer to send word to the transports that they have their 6 hours no matter what. Chief Engineer Kate Monroe was down in the engine room working on the old systems, and her voice came through the intercom, sounding tired but determined as she said, "Captain, I can give you everything this old bird has left in her, and we will burn out half the systems in the process, but she will fly and fight for you." The crew began their preparations for a battle that none of them really believed they could win, but they did it anyway because that was their duty. And Weapons Officer Lieutenant Chris Palmer armed every single torpedo tube and charged all the railguns, while Navigator Ensign Lisa Chen plotted evasive patterns that would hopefully maximize their survival time. And Medical Officer Dr. Sam Rodriguez prepared the sickbay for casualties. Even though everyone knew deep down how this was going to end, Jake opened a channel that went to every deck and every station on the ship, and he said, "Crew of the Defiant, today We face impossible odds, and no one will blame you if you are afraid. Because I am afraid too, but behind us are 3 million people who deserve a chance to live, and we are going to give them that chance, and we are going to hold this line, and we are going to make the Corvins pay for every second they take from us. So everyone go to battle stations now. The Corvin fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a perfect formation that looked like a wall of steel and plasma weapons filling up the entire view screen, and the lead ship, the Eternal Dominion, was so huge it made the Defiant look like a tiny toy in comparison. A transmission came through, and the image of the Corvin fleet commander, named Zektar, appeared on the main screen, and his scaled alien features twisted into what might have been amusement or contempt as he looked at the single human ship standing in his way. Zektar spoke in a voice that was cold and confident, and he said, "Human vessel, you are outnumbered and outgunned, so withdraw immediately or be destroyed, and there will be no mercy for those who stand against the Empire." Jake leaned forward in his command chair and looked directly at the alien commander and said, "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Terran vessel Defiant, and we will not withdraw because this is our space, and you will have to go through us to take it." Zektar's expression changed and became hard and angry, and he said, "Then you will die, for nothing, and all your courage will be wasted." And then he gave the order to his fleet, saying, "All ships' weapons free and eliminate the Terran vessel immediately." The battle for New Haven Station began in that moment, and space erupted into chaos, as dozens of Corvin ships opened fire at the same time, and the Defiant's shields flared bright blue as plasma bolts from every direction converged on their position, and the ship shook from the impacts. Amy called out from her station saying, "Shields at 70% and holding," and then she added, "Returning fire now," and her hands moved quickly across her console. The Defiant's main railguns fired and sent tungsten slugs downrange at speeds so fast they were almost impossible to see, and the nearest Corvin destroyer took 3 direct hits and its shields failed, and the 4th shot punched right through its hull, and the enemy ship began to list sideways as atmosphere and debris vented into space. Chris Palmer said with grim satisfaction, "First blood goes to us, Captain," but then he added, "But they are spreading out and trying to surround our position." Paul watched the tactical display and saw the pattern developing, and he said, "They are using pack tactics, which is standard Corvin doctrine, with 50 smaller ships to pin us down while their heavy cruisers move into position." For the kill, Jake nodded and opened a channel to engineering and said, "Kate, I need everything you have got." And then he told Amy to target their heavy ships because if we can take out their big guns, the smaller craft will be less effective. Amy responded quickly saying, "Sir, I have targeting solutions plotted for their 3 battle cruisers and firing torpedoes." Now 6 quantum torpedoes streaked toward the Corvan. Heavy ships trailing bright exhaust and the enemy point defense systems managed to intercept 4 of them, but 2 found their marks, and 1 Corvan battle cruiser reeled from the impact as its forward section erupted in flame and radiation, but the victory was very brief because the Defiant shuddered violently as enemy fire found weak points in the shields and warning alarms began blaring across the bridge. Lisa reported shields down to 40%, and we have a hull breach on Deck 7 in Section 12, but emergency bulkheads are holding for now. Dr. Rodriguez's voice came through saying, "Bridge, I am getting casualties from Deck 7, and medical teams are responding to help." Then Jake gripped the armrests of his chair tightly and said, "Paul, get damage control teams to that section immediately, and Amy, keep up the pressure on their big ships." The Defiant dove and weaved through the storm of enemy fire, and her ancient engines were pushed far beyond what they were designed to handle. And down in engineering, Kate worked what seemed like miracles as she rerouted power on the fly and kept systems running that by all rights should have failed already. The first hour passed in a blur of weapons fire and desperate maneuvers, and then the second hour came and went, and the Defiant had destroyed 6 Corvin vessels and badly damaged a dozen more. But the price they were paying kept getting higher as shield generators began failing, and hull armor was scorched and breached in multiple locations, and the casualty count kept climbing. Lieutenant Dan Foster at the communication station announced, "Captain, we have a message from the evacuation fleet, and they say they are only 40% complete, and they need more time." Paul shook his head in disbelief and said, "We have already held for 2 hours against this entire fleet, and how much longer can we possibly last?" Jake set his jaw and said, as long as they need us to. On the human side, Admiral Christine Bradley faced similar debates within the Terran Defense Council, because many members wanted revenge for the colonies that were lost in the war's opening days, and they wanted the Corvins to pay dearly for New Haven, even though humanity had actually won that particular battle. Bradley argued in the council chambers, saying, "We have bled them badly, and every engagement we have, they lose more ships than we do. But that does not automatically mean we are winning this war, because war is not just about body counts and kill ratios, but about achieving objectives. So what exactly is our objective?" Here one council member stated flatly, "Our objective is survival, pure and simple." Bradley countered immediately, saying, "We have already achieved survival because the Corvins cannot conquer us anymore, and they do not have enough ships or the political will to continue, and now we need to decide whether we want victory or whether we want peace, because those might actually be two very different things." The debate continued for weeks while along the border between human and Corvin space, the ships from both sides continued their deadly dance, but both fleets noticed something changing in the nature of the engagements, because they became less aggressive over time and ships would face off and exchange fire at long range and then withdraw. And it was as if both sides were just going through the motions while waiting for orders that would finally end this costly war. Then 8 months after the stand at New Haven, a Corvin diplomatic vessel entered the Sol system under a flag of truce, and Grand Admiral Velkas himself stood on the bridge as they approached Earth under peaceful circumstances. He said to his aide, "I never thought I would see the human homeworld except as a conqueror." The aide asked nervously, "Is it truly peaceful, Admiral? Because they could destroy us with a single missile right now." Velkas agreed, saying they could destroy us easily, just as we could have destroyed their evacuation transports at New Haven. But we did not, and they will not do it now. Because sometimes warriors recognize each other across battle lines, and they understand honor. The peace talks began in orbit above Earth, with Admiral Bradley representing humanity, and Grand Admiral Velkas representing the Corvin Empire, and they met in a neutral chamber on a space station, and they were two warriors who understood the true cost of war. Velkas began by saying, "Your ship the Defiant, and I was there when it made its final stand. And I have seen many battles in my long career, Admiral Bradley, but I have never seen anything quite like what happened that day, because 200 people held off my entire fleet. And when our flagship moved to destroy them, they turned their ship into a weapon and eliminated our command structure. And it was the most extraordinary act of courage and desperation I have ever witnessed in all my years." Bradley nodded slowly and said Captain Morrison was a good man and his crew was the best we had, and they gave absolutely everything so that civilians could escape to safety. And that is what humanity does, Admiral, because we protect our own no matter the cost. Velkas said, "I understand that now in a way I did not before, and I have recommended to my government that we end this war immediately, and not because we could not continue fighting, because we could throw more ships at you, and you would throw more back at us, and we could fight until both our civilizations are completely exhausted. But to what end? And what would we gain?" Bradley observed, "The Defiant broke your fleet's advance that day, but they broke something else too, did they not? Because they broke the myth of Corvan invincibility." Velkas inclined his head in acknowledgement and said, "They showed us that humanity will not accept conquest quietly, and that you will fight with everything you have, and that lesson cost us very dearly in lives and ships." The negotiations took several months, but both sides wanted peace more than they wanted to admit publicly, and the final treaty established clear borders and created demilitarized zones, and most importantly, it included a mutual defense pact, where the two powers that had nearly destroyed each other agreed to defend each other against external threats. Some people on both sides called it weakness and surrendering to the enemy, while others called it pragmatism and smart strategy, but most people recognized it for what it truly was, and that was respect earned through terrible sacrifice. 1 year after the stand at New Haven, a monument was unveiled at the site where the battle had taken place, and human and Corvin ships arrived together for the ceremony in a scene that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. And the monument was elegantly simple in its design because it was a piece of the Defiant's hull plating that was scarred and burned and melted, and it was mounted on a base of stone taken from both Earth and the Corvin homeworld, and engraved on that stone were the names of all 200 crew members who had died holding the line. Admiral Bradley spoke at the ceremony with Grand Admiral Velkas standing respectfully beside her, and she said, "The crew of the Defiant did not die to start a war or to end a war, but they died to save lives, and 3 million people owe their very existence to that sacrifice. But their legacy goes far beyond those 3 million individuals because their stand showed both our peoples what we are truly capable of when pushed to our absolute limits. And they showed us that courage is not about winning, but about standing firm when everything and everyone tells you to run away." Velkas spoke next, and his words were translated for the human audience, and he said, "I fought against the Defiant that day, and I lost many warriors and good friends and my commander to that battle. But I have come to understand that Captain Morrison and his crew were not really our enemies, but they were our teachers, and they taught us the true price of honor and the real cost of courage and the incredible value of life, and we thought we were conquering a weak species that would submit easily. But instead we found a people who would rather die than abandon their principles and their people. And the galaxy is genuinely better for having such people in it." As the ceremony concluded, Admiral Bradley and Grand Admiral Velkas stood together in silence looking at the memorial, and around them survivors of the evacuation mingled with Corvin officers, and former enemies were finding common ground in their shared respect for sacrifice and honor. Laura Monroe, who was now a cadet engineer at the Academy, touched the piece of hull plating very gently, because this metal had been part of the ship her mother died on, and had shielded her from enemy fire in those final, desperate hours, and she felt tears on her cheeks, but she was not ashamed of them. A voice beside her said, "She would be proud of you," and Laura turned to see Alex Morrison in his Academy uniform that marked him as a command track. "Cadet," Laura replied, "they would all be proud of what we have become. And look at what they built with their sacrifice, because it is not just peace but real understanding between former enemies." Alex nodded in agreement and said, "Uncle Jake used to tell me that the true measure of a warrior is not how well they fight, but what they fight for, and they fought for the right reasons. And now we have to live up to that example." Across human space, the story of the Defiant became permanent legend, and children played games reenacting the last stand, and songs were sung in memorial halls, and new ships were named after the fallen crew members, and the Defiant herself was never replaced because her name was retired in honor, and it was too sacred to ever use again in Corvin space. Something unexpected happened because the warriors who had fought at New Haven spoke of the human ship with genuine awe, and young Corvin warriors began studying human tactics and human determination and human willingness to sacrifice for others, and a new generation grew up respecting the species their parents had once sought to conquer and destroy. 20 years after the stand at New Haven, Captain Alex Morrison took command of the USS Resolute, which was a new heavy cruiser built with both human and Corvin technology working. Together, and his chief engineer was Commander Laura Monroe, and together they represented something that would have been impossible before, and that was a human warship with Corvin liaisons aboard, serving in a joint peacekeeping fleet on the Resolutes. Bridge Alex stood before his crew for the first time as their captain, and behind him hung a display showing the USS Defiant in all her glory. He said that ship and her crew taught 2 civilizations what it truly means to hold the line. And my uncle, and Commander Monroe's mother, and 198 others chose to stand when logic said to run, and they chose duty when survival beckoned, and they chose others over themselves, and that is the standard we serve under today." He paused and looked at the faces before him, which included both humans and Corvins serving side by side, and he continued, "We are not the Defiant, and we can never be, because they were unique and they were a moment in time that can never be replicated, but we can honor what they stood for, and we can be the shield when others need protection, and we can hold the line when it needs holding, and we can do it together as allies, proving that what they died for was not just survival, but a better future for everyone." The crew stood at attention, and in that moment the legacy of the Defiant lived on, not in glory or revenge, but in unity, forged from sacrifice, and in peace earned through courage, and in the understanding that sometimes one ship and one crew and one moment of defiance can change the entire course of history forever. The Terran ship had held the line against an entire empire, and in doing so, it had built a bridge between civilizations and